to be invited to this Blue House event to share with you.
I'm so sorry. I didn't click record until just now. Would you mind just starting again one more time? My apologies.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Kuei-Hsien. It's my honor to be here to be able to share with you my perspectives on flood resilience. I guess without further ado, I'll just start. Or actually, I'll just introduce myself a little bit. So you can now see my share screen, right? So I'm an associate professor currently at the Graduate Institute of Urban Planning from National Taipei University in New Taipei City, which is a city outside of Taipei. So my topic today, I call it flood resilience, a different approach to flood safety, because like Aaron said, you will hear a bit different kind of perspective. Especially I will be challenging the use of flood control infrastructure. Okay, I'll just start. Okay, so the reason that I think that the whole notion of flood resilience is important, especially in the face of climate change, because we have this new challenge in flood hazard mitigation. Flood hazard mitigation will be the subject of question that I'll be addressing for this entire talk. Okay, so because we have this new challenge of extreme precipitation events that can overwhelm the capacity of flood control infrastructure. I think you all know that flood control infrastructure has limited capacity based on its design standard, okay? But before I talk more about that.
I think we're not seeing your screen yet.
Oh, not yet? Okay, I'm sorry.
Can you try sharing it again?
Okay. Somehow I don't see that. Oh, okay, yeah.
Yep.
How about now?
Perfect, thanks.
Okay, sorry. So I'll start. You can still see it, right? Okay. I think I've passed this one. Okay. Before I dive into the notion of flood resilience, I think it's important to clarify the idea of flood hazard. That when you have a flood by itself, it doesn't necessarily lead to a hazard. A flood becomes a hazard only when it occurs in human settlements. So the reason that we need to get this clear, because currently or in the past, that this whole modern flood hazard mitigation has been focusing on that flood itself. That when a flood disaster occurs, people tend to blame the water itself, but we seem to forget that human settlement is also an important part that we need to address. So we pay too much attention. We pay a lot of attention to flood, and we use this so-called flood engineering or engineering control of flooding in order to control the water, because we consider that, I mean, modern society have been considering that flood disaster or flood hazard has been the problem of the flooding itself. So we use things like levees, or we use channelization, flood walls, or upstream damming, or we straighten the channels, or we put in pumping stations. All of these are engineering measures in order to control flooding itself. But I argue, in the face of climate change, I think it's necessary to have a paradigm shift in flood hazard mitigation. This means that we shift the focus from flood itself to the human settlement, because the human settlement is also an important ingredient in flood hazard. So we should shift to how we could make human settlement resilient to floods. That's what I mean by a paradigm shift. So that also means we shift our focus from preventing floods to occur, which is all what flood control infrastructure does, from that to nurturing flood resilience. These two, in my perspective, are quite different, and I'll explain that later. But first, let's look at what resilience really means. I think there are many different interpretations of resilience, and from different perspectives, from different, I would say, disciplines. There are interpretations from engineering that focus more on recovery. There is also a tradition from ecology that interpret resilience quite differently from the perspective of engineering. And my take on resilience is based on this an ecological perspective. So based on this ecological perspective, resilience here means the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change so as to still retain essentially the same function, structure, identity, and feedbacks. So based on this perspective, I think resilience, we can look at resilience as having two capacities, right? The first is the capacity to tolerate change. And if that change cannot be tolerated, and the resilience also means the capacity to reorganize. So that means resilience is more than the capacity to recover. The reason I need to focus on this because I think in many of the discourses, including like World Bank or other kind of NGOs, many people tend to interpret resilience or equate resilience to recovery, but resilience is certainly more than that. So based on that ecological perspective and the notion of ecological resilience that I just presented, this is my definition of flood resilience. Okay, flood resilience means the capacity to tolerate flooding, or in a case when flooding causes physical damage and socioeconomic disruption, it is the capacity to quickly reorganize so as to maintain current socioeconomic identity. So this is my definition of flood resilience. This really means, so flood resilience really means a flood tolerance, right? If you could tolerate, or if a system could tolerate flooding, that means the system will not suffer from any damage or disruption. But if that flood cannot be tolerated and some disruption or damage occurred, flood resilience here also means the reorganizing capacity. If the system can reorganize itself as quickly as possible, that could also, that system could also be considered to have flood resilience. So I think that second part of definition are more familiar to people. I want to focus on the first part of definition because this part is a part that people tend to ignore and people have not been really talking or exploring too much. And here is this definition. I define flood tolerance as the degree to which a human community can remain undamaged and undisrupted when it undergoes flooding. What that means is really this. So I'm sure most of you know what this is. I'm sorry I have to share, I use this photo of New Orleans under flooding. I'm sorry if this caused some painful memories for some of you, but I want to use this photo to demonstrate. Whenever we see a photo with, say, a city or a town underwater like this, we tend to have a negative feeling about this. People will describe the photos, a photo like this, disastrous or bad or not desirable or cannot happen or not acceptable. But what if, I'm just saying that if we could just imagine for a little bit, what if a city underwater is normal? And what if there is no damage, there is no disruption, even if the entire city is underwater? This is what I mean by flood tolerance. Flood tolerance means being floodable, right? Meaning being flooded without disruption and damage. Of course, this photo shows otherwise, but I'm saying that what if we can do something and make flooding entirely normal and make flooding not damaging and not disrupting. This is what I mean by floodable. And we could do something. We could change, we could redesign our city to make a city floodable. That's what I mean by flood tolerance. Okay. So I'm sure people would think that I'm talking nonsense, but before I explain how this could be achieved, I think it's important to clearly distinguish between these three terms. Flood doesn't necessarily mean flood hazard and doesn't necessarily mean flood disaster, because flood, like I just said, is a physical phenomena, right? And in the wilderness, when there's no human settlements, periodic flooding is actually very important to maintain river health. A river needs floods. A river needs periodic flooding. So if we can just consider flood being a physical phenomena. So only when flooding occurred in human society or a human settlement does a flood pose a threat. So flood hazard means flooding that poses a threat to human society. So flood disaster means flooding that actually leads to damage and disruption to human society. So flood hazard doesn't necessarily mean flood disaster. So I think these three terms, they are all related, but they are slightly different. They're not necessarily the same. Okay, so going back to this idea of flood tolerance or the idea of being floodable, most people, it's very difficult for most people to imagine how that could be possible. But so I want to give you an example of flood resilience. I want to give you an example of how people can still live normally and can still survive better than survival when they undergo very prolonged flooding. And this case is in the Vietnamese Mekong Delta in the southern part of Vietnam. And I've done research, I've done field work of the two very small villages in the border between Cambodia and Vietnam in this very gigantic Mekong Delta. And I'll show you my research finding. So, but first, let's look at their flood regime. So again, this red course, this red course shows where the villages that I have done research. And so they're here. Okay, so you can see that basically these villages that I've done research, they have to undergo 3 to 4 months of flooding from all the way from July to October, 3 to 4 months of inundation of their villages, 3 to 4 months a year. And the flood peak is about 1.5 meters high. So it's quite high. That's about my height. So basically it submerged the whole human being of myself, okay? And but flood water rises and falls very slowly at a rate of 2 to 5 centimeters a day. So this just shows that the entire flood regime. So the right diagram here shows the flood depth in a very serious flooding in 2000. In 2000, in some places of the delta, the water can exceed 5 meters high. So it's very, very, very high flood water. Okay, so if you go to the area during the dry season, you see an expanse of rice paddies, basically rice fields. But if you were to go there during the rainy season or during the flood season, you see a sea of water like this. Basically, the local people describe this like a sea. But this photo is a bit deceptive because that was a year when they experienced very low water. If you were to go there in a more normal years, you will see the water much, much higher than this. But basically, this photo was taken from exactly the same location. So you can see that the landscape changed during the flood season. So how do they survive? So basically they just change their livelihood, right? From rice farming to fishing. So as long as they have fishing gears, life doesn't really change that much. And actually what's really good about this is the whole well, flooding for them is wonderful because you can imagine that flood brings fertilizers and a lot of fish. And actually it's great for poor people because during the dry season, there's people own their lands, right? There are people, only people who own their land are able to do farming, to able to get food from their land during the dry season. But there are a lot of poor people in the region. They don't own any land. That means in the dry season, they don't have any food to eat. I mean, they cannot rely on their land to feed themselves. But something very interesting occurs during the flood season, that when the whole area is flooded, interestingly, property lines disappears. The whole thing becomes open, becomes a public area, a public sea. So you can fish anywhere you want as long as you have fishing gears. You don't, even if you don't own the land in the dry season, you can fish anywhere you want, right? So that is really good for the poor people because they can start to feed themselves. So flooding, flood, this phenomena, for them, when the flood season comes, they will refer to friends coming back, or they will refer to a flood season as an income season because they will be better off compared to the dry season when they cannot grow any food because they don't own any land. So that's what I found interesting in this place. Okay, so how do they survive during in such a high water? So basically, they just build on stilts. So this is a very densely populated village. Basically, you can see that the stilt houses are just side by side each other, and they each house are actually these stilt houses grows taller and taller each decade because they would adjust the height. You can imagine that they would adjust the height of the house after each flood. If a flood goes higher than the floor of the house, they would try to save. Actually, they will always save money for raising their houses. So if you encounter a flood that is higher than your floor, then very soon after the flood recedes, you will hire people to raise your house. So when I was there in 2014 and 15, these houses were about 2 meters high. That was because there was a previous flood in 2000 that before 2000, the houses were about like 170 or 160 centimeters tall. But after that 2000 flood, when the flood, when the height of the water exceed 2 meters high, everyone raised their houses. So I'm sure that if you were to be there in 1950, the houses probably were only 150 centimeters high. So interestingly, the house just grow taller and taller and taller over time. Okay, so of course they keep livestock, and they try to make, so they use stilt houses for their living. And I don't know if you could see what this is. This is a pig pen. So they have this floating, how do you call this? They have these flotation device, I guess, underneath the pig pen. So the pigs really doesn't need to do anything during flooding, and they will not drown. So they could make sure that their livestock are safe during the flood season. And of course, to maintain mobility, people have to learn how to pedal. So even very young children, they were trained to pedal, to use a boat, small boat, to move about during the flood season. And of course, it is very important for them to learn to swim. When I was there doing my field work, a question that I would ask everyone is, do you know how to swim? And I got laughed at this question because They didn't even think that I should ask this question because they of course can swim. And they think this is a dumb question. So, but as a researcher, I have to ask that question. But basically they have to make sure that their kids can swim and their kids can know how to use the boat during the flood season, so they can still go to places during the flood season. And besides using the boat, they also use very simple footbridges, and these are temporary bridges that are only assembled during the flood season. You can see this is a very simple structured bridge that they call this monkey bridge. I don't know why they call it monkey bridge. Maybe because people look like monkey when they are walking on the bridge, but it's very simple. I think this is also because this is a very poor area, so they try to use the as little material as possible to allow their mobility. And I want to say that it looks very easy for people to walk on the bridge, but when I was there, it was very difficult. It was very scary to walk on this kind of bridge. And yet the local people can walk on this, they could run on this, so you can imagine. So the reason I want to talk about this, I want to say this because I feel that living in this kind of environment, people have undergone a lot of training. They have to train themselves to balance on a small boat. They have to balance themselves on this kind of very simple monkey bridge. So basically, using this temporary footbridges is the main measure to maintain mobility during the flood season in these villages. And this is a photo of another village where people live much denser and much closer to each other. And then during the flood season, you will see they use this bridge to connect to different houses. And usually houses that are connected by different bridges are usually relatives or friends. So so I asked people whether flooding causes any inconvenience, and they say that it doesn't really make much difference as long as they have these bridges. The only difference it made is to their social life. And of course, and especially for people who like to drink. There was a middle-aged man that I interviewed. He said that flooding caused his inconvenience because when he got drunk, he couldn't balance himself on the monkey bridge, so he would fall into the water. So he doesn't like flooding. I guess that's only some of the inconvenience during the flood season. So like I said, it's a very poor area, so people use very simple material to construct their bridges. But there are also people who are better off, and for people who are better off, you will see that they use this kind of temporary bridges that made by concrete. So for this kind of bridges, they can even ride their motorcycles to their homes. So this is much more convenience. And of course, for people like this, nothing really changed between the flood season and the dry season. So my point here is, so I just show you the Vietnamese Mekong Delta villages as an example of flood resilience. My point here is that periodic flooding here is not really a desert, not really a hazard, but it is an important development resource. It provides drinking waters, it provides bathing waters, it provides fertilizers, and most importantly, it provides fish. And for them, the disasters is not the flood itself. The disaster is when they have a disaster, that is when flood doesn't come. So for them, they understand flooding very differently. And because they really need floods, they really need periodic flooding, they have to adapt to it. They take advantage of it. They adapt to it. That's why you can see that these villages, they have even if they undergo very high level of flood, a flood does not paralyze the everyday life. Life still go about very normally. And their flood resilience is derived from adapting to flooding, all kind of different measures to adapt to floods. So I want to come back to the scenario that we are more familiar with, cities. Right? Cities, is very different from the Vietnamese Mekong Delta, the villages. In the villages, they have no flood control infrastructure, of course, no levees, no flood walls, no any kind of flood control infrastructure. But in most of the cities in the world, modern cities in the world, we are protected very well. For example, this is Taipei. The photos you see is Taipei. This is during a very extreme precipitation, but somehow our flood wall hold the water, so it didn't really cause flooding. So our flood control infrastructure, the design standard in Taipei is very high, is able to defend us against a 200-year flood. So that I think that across the world, that is a very high standard. But my question here for you is, or for all of us to think about is, based on my definition of flood resilience, are cities like this, cities protected by flood control infrastructure of a very high design standard, are they flood resilient? Because we tend to associate flood resilience with flood control infrastructure, with resistance. But my question here is whether the cities protected well by flood control infrastructure actually have flood resilience. Let me explain why I think they don't have flood resilience. If we go back to our definition, resilience means flood tolerance and reorganizing capacity. Let's just look at flood tolerance, whether a protected, well-protected city has flood tolerance. I would say that in a city that is well protected by flood control infrastructure, it's very resistant to flooding because it resists floods, right? But it's not resilient at all. But if you look at the Vietnamese Mekong deltas, these villages, they are not resistant at all. They have nothing to resist a flood to occur, but they are very resilient. If we look at these two scenarios, we look at these two situations as two different kind of flood management paradigm. I would think that I would refer the left part being a flood control paradigm. That is because we often consider a flood to be a disaster. We don't like flooding, and we think anytime when we have water, it's not good, it's bad, flood is bad. We equate flood as disaster. In modern society, we equate flood as a disaster. Therefore, we do all we can to try to prevent flooding from occur because it's not a good thing. So of course we don't want it. So we use flood control. So I call this a flood control paradigm. In the right-hand side, in the Vietnamese Mekong Delta, I call this flood adaptation paradigm because flood is not a disaster. Not only it is not a disaster, it is a very important development resource. It has to occur, it has to come. Flood has to occur. So it's not about preventing flood to occur. It's about preventing a flood to become to create damage. So the whole point is to preventing damage at a flood, not to prevent the flood altogether. So these two are entirely different kind of paradigm when we think about how to achieve flood safety. The left is about preventing flooding to occur altogether. The right is about preventing damage at flood. So I just want to explore a little bit more about the relationship between flood control infrastructure and flood resilience to make it clear, right? I think there's this question, if building or reinforcing our existing current flood control infrastructure can actually promote flood resilience. I think it's very important to understand that the whole point of flood control infrastructure is about resistance. It's about resistant flooding. But I would say that resilience and resistance are two very different kind of things, right? Resilience is about adapt to and even take advantage of environmental change in order to persist, in order to survive. It's all about survival. It's all about persistence. But resistance is about control and prevent environmental change in order to maintain stability. So very important here is we try to achieve resistance because we want environmental stability. But environmental stability and resilience are actually two very distinct system attributes based on this ecological perspective of resilience. They are two different attributes, right? And again, stability is what flood control infrastructure is trying to achieve. But research has shown that highly stable systems are often less resilient, and resilient systems are often unstable. So it sounds very strange. It's a bit difficult to understand, but we just think about of any variable. For example, our economic, a certain economic variable. For example, a certain amount of money we make throughout the year. We want very stable income. That stable income is stability. But sometimes for people to not, it's not necessary that people making unstable income will be unresilient. I'm not sure if I make this clear, but basically resilience and stability, there are two different kind of things, and they could be contradictory. But social ecological research has shown that our human attempt to make inherently dynamic systems, for example, like a city that is subject to flooding, the human attempt to make inherently dynamic systems stable often results in the erosion of resilience. Therefore, I conclude that flood control infrastructure can actually erode flood resilience. There are several explanations to this. The first is that based on the resilience theory, flooding itself is a very important mechanism to nurture flood resilience because periodic flooding provides an opportunity to learn to survive. As you can see from the example from the Vietnamese Mekong Delta, the reason that people are so resilient to flooding because their parents, their ancestors have gone through periodic flooding years after years after years after hundreds of years of practice. They have developed this different variety of different ways to respond, to handle, to adapt to flooding. So each years of flooding can be considered a training opportunity for them to learn how to survive, right? So flooding itself is a critical mechanism for them to nurture flood resilience. Again, it doesn't mean that they have to suffer from flood disaster every year in order to learn. They only need to experience flooding as a really natural phenomena in order to train themselves to be able to handle flooding. So flooding is a very important learning mechanism. So when you prevent flooding altogether by flood control infrastructure, it really means that you eliminate the learning opportunities. Because when it rains or when it floods, people do not have to do anything because all the engineering structure have done everything for us. Basically, governments, engineers have done everything for us. We really didn't need to do anything. For example, in Taipei, I lived in Taipei for about 30 years. And I didn't really need to do anything when it rains. So for example, for Taipei City, that is very well protected. When there is a flood, people really didn't know what to do because they have no experience. Okay. And another explanation is related to this false sense of security that brought by flood control infrastructure. So when the government erect a levee or a flood wall, usually they tell people that this place will not flood anymore. But very few people actually know that flood control infrastructure, in effect, really just to reduce flood frequency. It doesn't mean that it will eliminate flooding altogether. but flood control infrastructure often provide this false sense of security that people think that if you leave behind a levee or a flood wall, the place won't flood anymore. So it leads to people to have their reduced risk awareness. When you have reduced risk awareness, when it eventually floods, because it will, and then people really don't know how to handle it. So, and also, again, sorry for using the photos from New Orleans, but you all know that during the Hurricane Katrina, structural failure, levee failure, flood wall failure created a lot more dangerous situation than the natural flooding, which often rises which often rises very slowly compared to flooding that caused by structural failure. Okay, so it could cause more deaths and damage than the natural flooding. So I want to come back to this idea of paradigm shift. So what I mean by paradigm shift and from this whole lessons of flood resilience is that we need to move from our focus on flooding itself, our focus on controlling the water itself using flood engineering, to focusing on the human settlement. We change our tool from flood engineering to change the river, change the water, to using urban design, to using environmental design measures to increase our floodability, to make our human settlement more floodable. So how do we do that? How do we make cities floodable through urban design? There are several ways. I'll go through that. So first, we should try to accommodate as much water as possible in open spaces. Actually, in the cities, there are many open spaces that could accommodate water. For example, this is the example from Denmark, Copenhagen, Denmark. They recently retrofit this parking lot that is asphalt, basically an asphalt field, into this rain gardens. With sunken rain gardens that could absorb, that could accommodate a lot of rainwater when it rains. So in the city, if we look closely, if we look carefully, there are many opportunities for us to do a similar kind of retrofit. And even a very small green area that we could retrofit this small green area to accommodate water. This is an example from Portland. They have done a lot of this kind of low impact development or natural drainage system that could accommodate rainwater as much as possible. Or even if we don't have green space, other kind of paved open space, because in the cities, we definitely don't have every green space to be permeable. So if we have to have open space that is impermeable like this, we can also make this temporary flood retention basin that could accommodate flood waters during the rain, and then when the rain stops, we could drain the water slowly, and we can return the open space to people gradually. I think that these are not new measures, and these have been practiced for, I would say, for a decade or two, that people are especially for those of us involved in the design field, you will know that this kind of design has become increasingly common. And because it's not possible for all the open space to accommodate all the water, even if we allow all the open spaces to accommodate flood water, there could still be a larger flood that submerge the entire cities. In this case, we need to further think about how we could flood-proof our buildings in the cities. And there are two ways. Of course, we can build on stilts, like what they have done in Vietnam. And I'm sure that after Hurricane Katrina, that in New Orleans, that people are starting to build their houses on fields or build their houses on stilts. And this is a modern version of the stilt houses in Vietnam. This is a sand town from the villages. This is a similar. This is the stilt house in a town near the villages that I just showed you. So they have architects to design this really fancy stilt house And this could, just like their counterparts in the villages, that could, it doesn't need to worry when the area is flooded. Or we can learn from the Netherlands to build amphibious houses. These amphibious houses have different kind of foundation. Right? So it actually float with the water. So I think that amphibious houses are excellent solutions for places where there are a lot of elderly people, because based on the experience in Taiwan, the elderly people, they don't like stilt houses because it would be a bit difficult for them to go up and down the stairs. Okay, so we could also, when we think about transportation during flooding, we can try to use temporary or permanent footbridges to allow for pedestrian mobility during flooding. For example, I'm sure you all know that Venice just suffered from one of its greatest floods in the recent history. So every year when they have flooding, they would set up these kind of temporary footbridges to allow the tourists, to allow their local residents to continue to go about their everyday business. So it's a very flexible approach, and it's very similar. If you think of it, it's very similar to the monkey bridge, the idea of monkey bridge in the Vietnam. So it really doesn't mean that the approach in Vietnam, actually the approach in Vietnam has already been taken in the Western world. So why not? We could, I don't see why not we should deploy this in cities that are increasingly suffer from flooding. Or if we don't like the temporary solution, we can think about a more permanent solution. This is a Hafen City in Hamburg. This is a redevelopment. This is a whole redevelopment project that occurred outside of the existing levee on the sandbar. So there are no levees to protect this development. So in order to reduce the flood disaster, in order to reduce the inconvenience during flooding, they have designed these two-tier bridges throughout the development area. So you can see that there are another level of bridge that allows for pedestrian traffic, for pedestrian walk during the flood season. During the flood, if all the area if the entire development is flooded, the residents could still use these footbridges to connect themselves. Okay, finally, we could think about developing amphibious transportation systems. For example, like this, this is not high tech. This kind of amphibious buses has existed for, I would say, decades. And you can see this in touristy areas. Many touristy areas have deployed this kind of vehicles for tourism. But in the future, if cities are going to be under water for a lot of times, we really need to think about these amphibious solutions. We need to have public transportation buses that could operate in both dry and wet conditions in order for people to continue their continue their everyday business even during the flooded situation. Okay, so these are actually measures that I'm sure if you are in the design and the design field, you probably will be very familiar. So I'm not talking about any high-tech situation, any high-tech solution, but if we could adopt this kind of solution and make it a larger scale application, I think it's possible for us to incrementally move our city to be more floodable. I'm not talking about building a new city altogether. I'm not talking about building new cities. We can retrofit our existing cities, so our existing cities can be floodable. So then we can re-examine whether we need to build more flood control infrastructure or even reinforce our existing flood control infrastructure. Because if we were to do that, we actually will risk losing our flood resilience. And I don't think that is a sustainable solution to think about our flood hazard mitigation in the face of climate change. So with that, that is what I would like to share with you today. And with that, I thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, then please feel free to raise them. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Before we dive into questions, I just want to say that this is, to me, particularly important because we're at a moment in time when the city is updating its every 5-year process, its hazard mitigation plan update. And then the Sewage and Water Board is kicking off its strategic planning process for drinking water, sewerage, and stormwater. And so I think the ways in which this conversation and the ways in which Liao Kuei-Hsien is talking about resistance versus resilience might inform different approaches to the kinds of public investments that we make.
Thank you.
Yeah, questions, feel free. If you don't want to speak, you can type in chat. But yeah. Bernadette, do you?
I'm not in New Orleans. I'm in New York, and so I was wondering about. Perhaps you mentioned this in the beginning. I'm sorry, I came in late. My 4-year-old did not want to sleep. But about the difference in kind of paradigms between freshwater flooding and saltwater flooding, and in particular, kind of, I was thinking about the projections I've seen for the Mekong Delta, in which it'll all be underwater in 12 months out of the year with saltwater by 2050 or something. And wondering how much of that floodability as a paradigm depends on the ability to make a living out of the land or out of the water. And so how that varies when salt and water. And I'm not a water or environment person at all. I'm a big fan of Eleanor Ostrom. You can see, sorry, the non-conservative parts of them. But thank you. That was a really fabulous presentation.
Thank you very much. I am not sure I get your question entirely because it was not very, your voice was not very clear, but I.
So it's just difference between fresh and salt water in terms of the paradigm.
I see. Okay. First, let me say that the reason that I champion for increasing floodability is because I don't really think that flooding itself and human settlements are incompatible. We can try to, I think we can try to live peacefully with flooding, and that flood could include any kind of flood, including saltwater flooding or fluvial flooding or pluvial flooding. I think all kind of, as long as this water is flooding, I think that we could deploy design solutions to try to live peacefully with flooding. So I don't think that it matters whether this whether it's saltwater or fresh water. And I want to add though that when I gave this kind of talk, there were also people asking me questions about whether if the water is very dirty, because usually when we have flooding, the water is not clean, and whether it is applicable to dirty waters. I would say that it's even more applicable to dirty waters because flood would occur eventually, and it will occur. So I think it's even more important for us to stay above the water. For example, using floatable houses or stilt houses in order to stay above the water. I think that's, or using bridges to stay above the water. So that's even more important. So I'm not sure I answer your question, but I think that this whole concept of flood resilience and increasing floodability applied to all kind of flood situation. But of course, when you have a flood that come with debris flow or very serious, I guess, high velocity floods, I think the best way is really to avoid living in an area when you have a very high speed, high velocity flooding. I would say, although I don't think that we have to put out the idea of retreat as the immediate solution, but I think it's wiser to avoid living in an area where flood water flows very quickly. Thank you. Yeah.
Hey, Robert.
Hey, Professor, that was a great presentation. Thank you so much
you.
for being here with us tonight. I would like to ask and talk about this. The kinds of changes that would have to be made in major US cities like New Orleans, like Houston, like Miami, to make them truly flood resilient in the way that we're talking about, might require dramatic changes to the appearance and the character of the city. You know, this idea that we have in a US city that everything is going to be dry all the time, that most of it is going to be paved, that people will have lawns of mesic grasses, you know? Some of that might go away if we turn New Orleans, for instance, into a water city. So there's going to have to be a cultural change, a change in what we accept as the normal appearance landscape of a city. So how can we quick start that process? How can we manage it for the citizens?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're absolutely right. This physical, the possibility to have this urban landscape change will really require people's change of their values, their understanding of flooding in the first place. I would say that it's not easy. And this is something also I'm trying to do in Taiwan. I'm championing the same thing in Taiwan. And I would say that Taiwan is more prone to flooding than a lot of other places in the world. So I don't consider this an easy task, and it won't happen overnight. So my estimate is that it requires at least 10 to 20 years of conceptual change. But I think people need to, the first thing I think people need to realize is flood itself is not necessarily a bad thing. And we may be, and because we're in an extraordinary time of climate change, we are in Anthropocene, and I'm sure most of you heard of that term. We're in a very different time than before. So of course we cannot we cannot solve the problem using the same tool. So our concept has to change. In the past, or still currently, we consider flood a bad thing, so we want to eliminate it. So maybe in the future, we really can learn from this traditional wisdom in the areas that have not relied on technology too much, that whether they can actually adapt to take advantage of the flood. So I'm not sure. In Taiwan now, I'm working on a project to really think about how we can take advantage of flooding, the flood water itself, and make the flood water flooding itself as a positive asset, as opposed to be a debt. Of course, in different places, you have to adapt different approach. I cannot say that what kind of approach should be deployed in New Orleans or Miami or other American cities, but I can only say, yeah, the conceptual change is critical. It's the very first step for the urban landscape change to be politically accepted.
Kuei-Hsien, would you be willing to stay for 5 more minutes?
Sure, of course.
And before I let anyone else ask a question, I was wondering, would you mind sharing a little bit about the work that you do on Facebook, writing op-eds, the work you do as an advocate? And I remember the last time we talked, you talked about how you're actively trying to change the language that people use. And I feel like that's really important in response to Robert's question.
Besides doing research, besides writing academic papers that nobody read, I mean, very few people will read that. I think that the more important things to engage in a greater change is to talk to the public. So I try to make my presentation and my writings easy to understand. So I do a lot of public writing online. Of course, they are in Chinese, so you cannot read. but I address my Taiwanese audience, and I let the governor know that I am happy to give a talk if they want to understand the idea of resilience, because resilience has been a very popular term. So I think the governments around the world, they want to understand, and they want to use it in their policy language. So I think they are more than happy for me to go to them and to talk to them about flood resilience. And I use Facebook a lot in order to engage a greater audience. So I would say that key government officials from the hydraulic engineering sectors, they are all following me, and they're my Facebook friends. So whenever I make comments on inappropriate projects, or I make comments, they understand that. So I think that because not all academics or not all researchers in the university are willing to do this, because this doesn't contribute to our promotion and tenure. That's why when someone is willing to do it, and you become relatively unique and known. So I guess because my fellow scholars are not willing to do it, I am one of the very few people who are doing it, so they noticed. So I think I'm making some impact, although the change has been slow. But I think that the government, the concept that the talk that I have just shared, I have shared many times with the government officials, and I think that increasingly they have started to understand. So they have changed building codes to allow the buildings to be built on stilts, or to avoid building on the first floor, and allocate more fundings to do similar research, and even putting flood resilience, the idea of flood resilience and non-structural measures in their policy document. And they are even willing to explore the idea of removing levees in some places. So I'm not saying that I think I have to do more, because the change is still not enough. And I think that the next important thing, or the important thing right now, is to really try to change the perception of the general public about their idea on flooding to be this evil and negative thing. And this is something that I don't know, I still don't quite know how to do, but I'm trying to figure out a way to change people's idea on flooding.
And one last question. Anyone has one? Hey, Sarah.
Hey, so I wanted to, Jessica and I had a similar question, just in thinking about this paradigm shift between a resistance-based versus a resilient-based system when it comes to major events like hurricanes, which, as we're seeing hurricanes intensify, and many of these kind of resistant systems are put in place to prevent those kinds of events from flooding. How do you think about that with regard to, what kinds of systems are important, and is it a mix of both resistance and resilience when it comes to something like that? Or is this really just around kind of your annual flooding based on heavy rainstorm or high river levels? So just curious how you think about those major events, because I think that's where a lot of the fear and the trauma in a place like New Orleans comes from.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a great question. I think that the reality now is that we have our cities protected already by flood control infrastructure. So we already have a certain degree of resistance. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that is, I don't think that I would, I don't think that it's necessary to get rid of this existing flood control infrastructure. So we just have to work with that resilience. We just have to increase resilience, at the same time not to further reduce not not to let the existence of flood control infrastructure to further erode resilience. So in a very strong hurricane, I think that people should evacuate. That is the very first thing. But I think that is, in addition to evacuating people, we also need to think about how to not let our properties to be damaged. So for example, in the case of Hurricane Katrina, there are people safely evacuated, but when they return home, their homes were damaged. So it's not very sustainable if we have people safe, but when our property is damaged, it will create a lot of garbage. So I think the best scenario is we have people who can be safe during the hurricane, and we also have our houses that are safe. Although we will be, when there is a very powerful hurricane, of course, we don't want to take the risk. I think it's the best that we evacuate everyone. But our houses are still there. We also need to make sure our houses are strong and resilient enough in order to not being damaged. So I think we need to do both. We need to, the similar practice we have done before during the strong hurricane, we evacuate people. We also at the same time have to adjust our systems in the city, our buildings, our open space, our infrastructure system. All of these has also at the same time, we have to make them floodable, in addition to our existing flood control infrastructure. Also, the third thing I think is important is to cultivate people's risk awareness. In the past, people falsely consider that as long as they are protected by flood control infrastructure, they will be safe. I personally think that is one of the main reasons that the disaster is so Hurricane Katrina created such a catastrophic event, because people didn't have risk awareness. If we could develop and cultivate our risk awareness, and we have our evacuation, we respond rightly in the face of hurricane, and we also make our cities, make our environment more resilient. I think that altogether it could help increase the flood resilience. Do I answer your question? I'm not sure. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Kuei-Hsien, thank you so much for starting your day with us. And I'm really thankful to all of you who joined us late on a Wednesday evening. And I think there's just being willing to dive into these really hard questions that I hope call into questions on the ways in which we think about the Army Corps' role, the Sewage and Water Board's role, our individual roles, and call into question the very ways in which we use words like flooding and flood risk and flood hazards. And I think I'm going to leave with that Venn diagram and the paradigm shift from trying to control water to trying to control the human settlement and all the complications and political difficulties that come with that. So thank you all so much. We'll share out a link to the recording. I hope you guys share it with friends and colleagues as well. Again, this couldn't come at a more important point. It's always important, but there's a lot of planning and thinking going on. And we either continue on a path of investing more and more in flood control and believing that's the kind of only direction we can take, or we consider some radically different solutions, which I think is more than just green infrastructure and living with water in some of the ways that we've been comfortable talking about for the last 8 to 10 years. All right, I know there are plenty, yes, thank you all so much. I'm going to stop the recording. If anyone wants to stay on the line, no pressure. I'll stay on for another 5, 10, 15 minutes. If anyone wants to keep chatting about water stuff, this is all I do. But I know everyone has dinners and families and pets and their work days to get onto. So thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate you, Aaron.
Good to see you, Harry. It's been a while.
Yeah, miss you.
Hey, Bernadette. Hey, Elena. Hey, iPhone Anthony. I don't know who you are, but
I love the bird song coming from your speaker, however.
who's Birdsong?
From iPhone Anthony. I, had written Dr. Liao because there's doing a search for a professor up here who does like resilient stuff, and she's so much better than anyone has given a shot. Like, I wish she'd apply and we could coach her. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not a decision maker, but anyway, thanks for having me, and it was nice to be able to join in.
Yeah, I think
Nice to see some of the people who were here a few weeks ago. So, yeah. Bye.